To tell us the story of one rather wonderful and surprising native animal, we have Liza Lair, the Assistant Director of the Urban Wildlife Institute and the Chicago lead for the Urban Wildlife Information Network. Well, good morning, Liza, and welcome to Inside Out and About. I am so delighted that you could join us for our journey along the Chicago River. This month, we're visiting Kickapoo Woods. And as with all of our locations, we're picking a wildlife species that we want people to learn about. And I know that you are an expert on woodchucks. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit today. But to start with, welcome to Inside Out and About.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you about woodchucks today.
Good. You are a part of the Urban Wildlife Institute, which is part of Lincoln Park Zoo. Tell our listeners, what is the Urban Wildlife Institute and what do you guys do?
Yeah, so the Urban Wildlife Institute is a science center that's based at Lincoln Park Zoo in the Conservation and Science Department. And, as our name kind of describes, we're really interested in understanding how animals live in cities. And we do a variety of different types of research based in Chicago, but then also across a network of partner cities across North America to study how animals are living in cities, how sort of the different aspects of urbanization influence their distributions, and how we can use all of that information to create cities that are more wildlife friendly.
So through your research over the past many years, what have you seen? What have you learned, and what can you tell the general public about the wildlife that's living in our cities?
Yeah, well, I think the biggest take home that we've seen, and we've been doing this research now for over 10 years. We started in 2010 with our biodiversity monitoring project based in Chicago. We have over 100 sites that we've been monitoring for that extent of time. And I think the biggest take home is that, there is a wide diversity of animals living in Chicago. And I think that is sort of the most surprising thing that a lot of people learn about our work is that, we have everything from, of course, coyotes to beavers to woodchucks that we're going to talk about today, flying squirrels, a huge diversity of birds, of course, and reptiles and amphibians, just a ton of diversity of wildlife that live right here in Chicago. And not just in, our beautiful forest preserves, but actually in the heart of the city. So I think that's one of the most exciting aspects to our work is that we're learning that, really urban places, like Chicago can be places for biodiversity, can be places that can host a lot of different wildlife species, especially if we kind of think critically about how we're designing our cities and the habitat within them.
That's a really important point. I know that our work with the Chicago River system, we're talking about wildlife connectivity and how important it is. And certainly I'm out in the forest preserves along the river all the time, and we've seen just amazing distributions. We've seen red foxes, we've seen clearly white-tailed deer, coyotes. We've seen one of the things that's really fun in winter is we see the beaten down path right through the snow. So if you get out there, you can figure out where animals are coming and going, even if you're not actually seeing wildlife in person. So we call them raccoon highways.
Yeah, no, that's one of the, I think, most fun parts about the snow in terms of wildlife is that you suddenly can see all these different species that you wouldn't normally be able to observe very easily in person, especially our, sort of more nocturnal species that are more active at night that we wouldn't be able to see. And, often animals are not going to come out when they know that people are right there. So it's hard to have those observations, but you can, with the snow, you can find these tracks and you can identify what animals were there and see sort of the pathways that they take and how they move through the landscape. I think that's just really fun and a great thing to do right now as you're out and about enjoying some of these green spaces that we have.
So I think that's a perfect segue to our topic today of the woodchuck, because I understand that woodchucks, also known as groundhogs, also known as whistle pigs, also known as a whole lot of other things, right? That they are really true hibernators. That's correct, right?
They are, yeah, absolutely. And just to emphasize that point, a lot of people get confused. Groundhogs and woodchucks are the same thing. So we use those two terms, those two common names to describe them. It's kind of a regional difference maybe, but some people prefer groundhog over woodchuck, but also known as whistle pigs in some places. So those are all the same animal. And they are true hibernators. They're considered the largest true hibernators. So differentiating from bears that can remain sort of more active throughout the winter, they might go into kind of more of a torpor where they're sleeping a lot and less active. But woodchucks actually hibernate in that their body temperature drops very low, almost to just a few degrees above the temperature of the ground that they're burrowing in. Their respiration slows down a lot. Their heart rate goes down to like 10 beats per minute or something while they're hibernating. So they do all of this to conserve energy to survive through the winter. And as such, sort of the time when they're active during the summer, they spend a lot of that time just eating. So when you observe woodchucks, you'll see them just foraging plants. They eat a lot of grass and clover and dandelions and things like that because they lose something like 35% of their body weight over the winter while they hibernate. So during the active season, they really have to spend all time as much as possible eating as much as they can to gain that weight back up and make sure that they have enough fat stores to make it through the winter.
So tell me about where they live. So I have seen a woodchuck along the Chicago River just once. We were in canoes up on the Upper North Branch. Along the Fox River, we've seen woodchucks. But once we were driving to Maine, and I think we were in Pennsylvania, and there were woodchucks all along the highway. So it made me like, what is it? What's a good habitat? What would make what makes a woodchuck happy in life?
Yeah, so they really like what we call edge habitat. So whenever sort of like a forest or like a shrubby area, fence row meets an open grassy area, that's where you typically are going to see them. We often see them in areas that have a little bit of elevation or topography. So they seem to really thrive out east in places that are a little bit more hilly than we have here in Illinois. So Ohio and New York and Maine and Pennsylvania, those are places where they're really numerous. Here they are less common, but we certainly see them throughout the state. And the places that we're seeing them often are along riparian areas, like you mentioned, the Fox River and the Chicago River. I think those are places where they can find easy areas to burrow because they have those riverbanks. And that helps because they are living in the ground. They use these really complex burrow systems. They need to have places where the burrows can sort of drain water. So they don't want to necessarily burrow in these, just flat places. They will do that, but they like to kind of burrow along kind of riverbanks and places of elevation. So yeah, edge habitat, river systems. We also see them along railroad tracks. Sometimes they burrow on those because those can be sort of elevated a little bit. And, like a lot of wildlife in the Chicago area, we think that they're moving along those pathways to be able to move across the landscape. So using railroad tracks to move in and out of the city, moving along the river systems as well. Those are the places that I have largely seen them in Chicago. But outside of Chicago, we often, or sort of in the more suburban areas, they might be in kind of a vacant, undeveloped lot because they eat a lot of grass and clover and plants and things like that. They like to be in those kind of open grassy areas. I'm trying to think of some other spots, but definitely along edges. Edges is kind of where they like to be. And then out in more rural areas, we see them certainly along agricultural fields. They might burrow in the ditches along like a soybean field. They like to eat soybeans, other types of agricultural crops too.
Okay. So what is the family structure of a woodchuck? What do they do? Are they alone? Are they in a family unit? What does that look like?
So the male and female mostly just come together for the breeding season. The males don't really hang out for long or help to sort of contribute to rearing the young. So mostly when you're seeing them together, you'll see a mom with her young of the year. You might see some juveniles from the previous summer hanging around into the next year for a little while. Usually by the age of 1.5, once they get to that second hibernation season, the young start to go off and find their own territories. And they are pretty territorial. So you often don't see, multiple groups living together. However, in urban areas, some of those kind of constraints with like a lot of wildlife species start to break down. So when habitat is really limited, you might see, a few family groups kind of living together at a site. They found some really great site. You might see a lot of woodchucks kind of hanging out together at a single location. But more likely you're going to see like a few with a mom hanging out and then a male that might come around kind of here and there.
Then in an urban location, like we're in, that connectivity of, ComEd corridors or rail lines, that becomes particularly important for.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially for an animal like a groundhog, I use that term interchangeably, groundhog, woodchuck. They really rely on those burrow systems very strongly. They don't have a huge defense mechanism besides escape. I mean, they are really tough animals. They have very strong teeth, and even from my experience capturing them and radio marking them, they can really bite when they want to. And they have some really strong claws for all of that digging. So they can put up a fight against predators, but for the most part, they really need that connectivity to be able to find new territories. So when those juveniles are going out on their own to set up their territories, That's really important, as well as when males are looking for females. So when they emerge from hibernation, because they're only active for a relatively short period of the year, the males have to go out and start looking for females to breed basically immediately. So some of them may be starting to emerge even as early as now. I had seen them out in the snow. You might even see some tracks. So this is kind of the time of year where the males will start to emerge. The males emerge sooner than the females. And so sometime between February, kind of mid-February and mid-March, they'll start coming out of their burrows and looking for mates. And so that connectivity is really important to have that edge habitat for them to be able to move throughout the landscape. They're also really vulnerable to vehicle collisions. So that's another important reason to be able to have connectivity for them so that they don't have to be crossing roads very often to reduce that risk. Because they are, they're only about, between 10 and 15 pounds as an adult. So kind of the size of a larger house cat. And they're low to the ground. And so it's kind of hard for people to be able to see them when they're driving. And they can move fast, but, crossing roads obviously poses a lot of risk for groundhogs and for a lot of different wildlife species.
Right. So moving to a new territory looking for females, how far would a groundhog go?
Great question. I'm trying to think of some animals that I had studied. So yeah, just to, give a little bit of background, I've studied groundhogs for my master's work down at University of Illinois for several years. And then I also led a study up here that was a collaboration with Lincoln Park Zoo and the Illinois Natural History Survey and U of I, as well as the DuPage County Forest Preserve District, looking at the impacts of relocation on nuisance woodchucks. So we are studying sort of what happens to them when they get relocated from a conflict situation with people. And we had one female that moved as far as 2 miles from the place that she was relocated to. And males can have pretty large home range sizes, something like maybe up to 30 acres or so that they can move around. It really depends on the type of habitat that they're living in. So if they're in an urban space, their habitats are going to be, and their home ranges are going to be more constrained because there's less connectivity. They have to cross roads and they don't really want to do that. So they're moving around less. But in sort of a more open rural kind of area, they might have a much, much bigger home range.
And so in the Chicago area, where would you tell people to go if they were to maybe even just find footprints in the snow? What would be your recommendation?
So yeah, like you mentioned, a lot of the sightings that we have heard about with groundhogs been along the river systems. So I would definitely head there. Looking along the banks of the river, what you're looking for is a pretty sizable hole in the ground that, isn't sort of that doesn't have clean edges. It's not going to be sort of like a human-made looking hole. It's going to have sort of some rough edges around it. It could be between, maybe as big as 10 to 12 inches wide. It's going to have a lot of dirt around the front of it. So as they dig up, they're going to scoot all that dirt behind them. And then there's often going to be multiple entrances around a single hole. So they're going to have, something like maybe 4 or 5 entrances in that area because they have this really elaborate tunnel system that they dig underneath the ground. So these burrow systems can be as deep as 6 feet in some places, and tunnels can be as long as 30 feet. So they're really scooting out a lot of dirt in those areas. And then they have different kind of escape hatches in different places so that they always have options of which hole to go into if they sense that there's a little bit of risk.
Yeah, it's cool. So back in the relocation and conflict, I know one of the challenges of our current world is that we find ourselves often in conflict with wildlife, which is, I think really disturbing. And a lot of it is education. So from your research, what have you learned about relocation, and what could we advise people about minimizing conflict with groundhogs, with, other wildlife?
Yeah, so the most important thing about, avoiding conflict with wildlife is thinking of the ways in which the space that you're living in where you're coming into conflict with them is creating sort of a more wildlife friendly habitat. So if you don't want them to be there, think of things to make it less inviting place for them. So often when it comes to groundhogs, they're digging under foundations. They might dig under your porch or under your stairs, under garages. They also really like vegetable gardens. So of course, if you have a really lovely vegetable garden, which is a great thing to have in your backyard, they might be attracted to that. So trying to exclude them from those areas. One way to do that is by putting chicken wire that you can kind of dig under the ground or under, whatever the surface is that your vegetable garden is in. So maybe if that's a raised garden bed, you're going to put it sort of around the raised bed part and kind of digging it under maybe about a foot so that they can't dig under the chicken wire. And that will really help a long way to preventing them from taking the things that you don't want them to take from the food perspective, but then also not kind of finding places for them to burrow into and to create their burrow systems.
Okay.
And then in terms of the relocation, often a lot of research has shown that relocation is often not very successful for a lot of animals because, for one thing, it often just opens up a territory for another animal to fill. So you might relocate them and then another animal is going to come back, and then you're sort of just doing this over and over again and not solving the problem. That's why we always recommend trying to find these areas that you can exclude and prevent the problem to begin with. The challenge with relocation is, of course, you're taking an animal from a place where it knows the landscape, it knows the risks, it has its own territory there. If you remove it and place it into a totally new area, it then might come into conflict with other people. It also might come into conflict with other animals that are already living there and have established their own territories there. It often, has to look for food in a new place where it's, doesn't know sort of where the good food is in that area, has to cross roads and things like that. So there's a lot of risks that are incurred by relocation. And in general, the survival is not very good in those situations.
So the ideal is to prevent the conflict or adapt to it to lessen it.
Exactly. Yep. That's the best course of action.
That's certainly what's happening at my house with our chicken coop and our vegetable garden and local, rabbits and other creatures who are interested, right? You just figure out how to work around it.
Exactly. And it's not easy. I don't advise this lightly. Like I have conflict situations in my yard as well that I'm always like, I got to figure this out. But the benefits, of course, of living around wildlife sort of, in my opinion, far outweigh the drawbacks because we get to have these amazing experiences by observing animals in living around us in our daily life. And, to me, those are very fulfilling and sort of joyful experiences and really enhance my life in the city. So I love living around wildlife, and we all try to just do our best to be able to sort of coexist. They were here before we were, right? So
right. I could not agree more. And one of the things I've been reading about and we've been talking about a lot at Friends of the Chicago River, and this isn't unique to us, but this whole idea, and certainly in the last year with people, working from home or out at work and experience this high level of stress from the pandemic, is the need for being outdoors and how good it is for your health, both psychologically and physically. And I think having healthy wildlife communities adds to that because there's so much to learn. To me, it's completely a thrill to come across a wild animal or their tracks in the woods, in my garden, a hawk overhead. And so I really agree with you. And our work is clearly focused, much like yours, is to figure out how we make our world better for people and for wildlife of equal value. So that's something we're really focused on. So before we wrap up, I meant to ask you this at the beginning, which is, you are our region's resident woodchuck expert. What led you to the woodchuck?
Well, I have to admit, before I started researching them, I really didn't know that much about them. They're not a species that I think, especially in this part of the country, are very well known. You don't observe them too often. I think I had probably at least been aware of observing them maybe a few other times that I could think of before I started studying them. But similar to the study of urban wildlife, once you are aware of them being there, you start to see them a lot more, right? I think a lot of people can say that about the wildlife in the city, that once you're aware of it, all of a sudden you start really noticing the predator-prey dynamics that are happening all around you, the hawks that are flying in our neighborhoods and hanging out near the bird feeders, and the coyote maybe that is down by the river or something. So yeah, I didn't know a whole lot about them before I started studying them, but what made them kind of an ideal study species, and my focus in my research was understanding the impacts of urbanization. And they're a known urban adapter. So they do well in urban areas, especially in places that have some edge habitat, have some kind of grassy vacant fields along suburban office parks and things like that. They seem to adjust to being around people. And so they really kind of presented an ideal study species for that reason. But then we also wanted to look at both survival rate as well as behavior. So understanding sort of how behavior also influenced their survival rates. And so to do that, I wanted to be able to do some behavioral observations for my work. And that's another really great thing about woodchucks is that they're active during the day. So they're one of those species that we can actually go out. If you know that there's a burrow someplace, you could actually go sit out there with your binoculars and try to, quietly wait for them to emerge from their burrows and be able to observe them. And so that's what I did for a lot of my research, was not only radio tracking them and tracking their movements, but also sitting out and doing behavioral observations. Actually, I did them from the cover of a vehicle so that they couldn't really see me or smell me sitting out there. But I would sit in my car and kind of park nearby where I could see them and just wait for them to emerge. And
great. And a big giant blind, right?
Yeah, exactly. It was just like a blind, and they're used to cars being in their environment. But what was really interesting is that if you got out of the car, even if you were a good distance away from them, they immediately took off and flushed. So they would, they're used to certain things being in their environment, or certain sort of routine things, like people walking on a specific sidewalk, for example. But if somebody diverged off that path of what they, knew as their kind of routine, that's when they took off, and they perceive that as being a risk. So yeah, they make a really great study species, so that we could look at sort of how behavior affects sort of survival rates, and then looking at some of the other factors. As I mentioned, they spend a lot of time foraging, but then the other part of that is what we call vigilance behavior. So in order for them to be on the lookout for risks, for predators, for people that might be approaching them, they'll spend a lot of time actually in an upright position, just like listening and looking for risk. And they are a squirrel species, so very similar to squirrels. So we were looking at sort of the trade-offs between foraging and vigilance, and whether that was sort of, they spent less time being vigilant, did that translate into kind of a lower survival rate, and what those trade-offs were for them. So yeah, it was really fun to do that.
Yeah, no, that sounds like fascinating research. But that would be amazing. That's kind of my dream, is sitting quietly somewhere where there's wild animals moving about and you can see them. Certainly, we've done that with beavers at beaver ponds super early in the morning, where there's a beaver swimming around and you're just sitting still and watching. So that's magical. So we're out of time, I think, but I wanted to ask you, is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners about woodchucks or urban wildlife as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, just some fun facts about woodchucks. I think that people don't realize, they're our largest ground squirrel. They're sort of one of the most wide-ranging, I think, of the ground squirrels. So they range all the way up to Alaska, all the way down to Georgia, mostly sort of east of the Mississippi. A little bit goes in, a little past the Mississippi. So they're really adapted to living in a lot of different environments. And so they have, their hibernation kind of varies substantially from being very short in really warm places to being really long in other places. So I think that's what makes them really interesting, is that they sort of are very adaptable in that way. They can climb trees, and they can even swim. So yeah, they're a pretty cool species. And and in terms of urban wildlife, just sort of as I've mentioned, there's a huge diversity of animals that are living all around us in the Chicago area, especially along the Chicago River, which is a very important habitat for our wildlife species. So I just encourage everybody to get out there and kind of use your senses to listen and to observe for the wildlife that are around you. Grab some binoculars, and yeah, there's a lot to see out there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. I found this entirely fascinating. So I look forward to your book on woodchucks, the way I read that beaver book, right? So,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so get to work. It's everybody wants to know this. But thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for having me. It was my pleasure.